And now, from the great state of Mississauga in Ontario, Canada, it's the Ted Wallachin Podcast. Brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's fashion, Tom's Place will suit you. And ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. ETP Canada. And now, here's Ted.
My special guest this week is one of Canada's most respected journalists. He is the former chief correspondent for the CBC News, anchor of The National, and host of Mansbridge One-on-One. For his work, he has received more than a dozen national awards for broadcast excellence, including a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Academy of Canadian Cinema and Television. He is an officer of the Order of Canada and the author of 3 national bestsellers, including his latest, Peter Mansbridge, Off the Record. First of all, Peter, thank you very much for taking the time. I appreciate you doing this for me.
Hey, Ted, no problem.
And secondly, I truly enjoyed the book.
You actually read it? Oh, come on, Ted, be honest. Did you read it?
I'm not Margaret Thatcher. That's not a bad answer, huh?
That's a very good answer.
You interviewed Margaret Thatcher. She was not the most pleasant woman to speak with.
No, she wasn't. I mean, listen, I'd interviewed her a couple of times before at different news events, and everything had been fine. This was after she'd left office, and she was selling a book, kind of like I'm doing now. But she was just in a terrible mood. She was here in Toronto. It was at the old King Edward Hotel. Mm-hmm. And we were sitting there, and every question I asked her, she said, well, you obviously haven't read the book. Truth was, I had read the book, and it wasn't very good, and I should have said that, but I didn't. Kind of chickened out and kept trying to get at what I was trying to get at, and it didn't work, and it was just the whole interview was a disaster. So I fess up on that one.
And did she not say to you, would you like me to sign the book? And you were tempted to say no thanks?
Yeah, at the end of the interview, after it was over and the cameras were off and everything, she smiled for the first time. She's kind of looked at me and she said, Peter, would you like me to sign this book? And you can imagine what I felt like telling her she could do with the book. But I said, no, I'd love you to sign the book. And she did.
And didn't she say that you contemplated saying, did you write the book?
I did contemplate saying that, and I should have, but I wimped out, and I didn't, because she hadn't written the book. She was written by 3 ghostwriters. So, you know, I don't know whether she'd read the book, let alone written it.
So your book, Off the Record, as I'm reading through this, as I'm taking my own notes, and I'm thinking, how does one sit down with a 50-year career and decide, it's not a memoir. I know you made that perfectly clear in some of the other interviews you did.
Right.
You talk about various incidents that you covered over the years and various stories, and some funny, some very poignant. But I wonder, how does one sit down and decide what makes the cut and what doesn't make the cut?
Well, that was the fun part of it. You know, I mean, as you said, 50 years, a lot of stories, just like your career. You know, a lot of things have happened, and I've always found that the best stories are the ones that you didn't tell on air, the ones you end up telling it, you know, when you're having dinner with friends or what have you, and they say, what was so-and-so really like? And you tell them not what was on the air, but what was happening around the interview or the event. And so I started, you know, writing down things, just sort of keywords to different events or moments, and then expanded from that. And, you know, when I got to 90,000 words, I stopped.
I love the dedication at the beginning of the book where you dedicate it to your grandchildren, quote, so they have some memory of or some indication of what Grampy did before they came along.
Exactly. You know, I mean, if you've read it, and I believe that you have,
I have.
You know, it traces through about a 50, 60-year period there. Mm-hmm. And lots of different things happened. And, you know, I was extremely lucky in my career. I was, you know, obviously all over the country, but also all over the world. I saw things, some of which I wish I'd never seen, met people. And it was, you know, it was quite an experience.
I've interviewed so many people over the years, and I'm always curious to find out, especially people in our industry, how they began, what was the start of their career like. I thought if I ever wrote a book about people and how they began their careers, the first chapter would have to be you, because the way you launched your career was something out of a movie. It was like a Lana Turner story. I think you referred to it as. Can you give us that bit of a background on that?
Well, I'll give you the snapshot. I mean, I didn't finish high school. I never went to university. I was in the Navy for a little bit. That didn't work out so well. By the time I was 19, almost 20 years old, I was in Churchill, Manitoba, on the shores of Hudson Bay, working for a little regional airline called Transair. And for the most part, I was, handling baggage and freight. But one day, the ticket agents at the counter were really busy. They'd oversold the flight, which was not an uncommon experience there, because a lot of people didn't turn up. So you oversold, assuming that. Anyway, it was oversold, and they did turn up. And so there was a bit of chaos at the counter, and they asked me if I'd announce the flight over the PA system so we could at least start moving some people out to the plane, which I did. Very straightforward, Transair Flight 106 for Thompson, the Pond, Winnipeg, now ready for boarding at Gate 1. We only had one gate, but it sounded really professional, and so I did it, and people rushed off towards the gate, except one guy came towards me. And he said, "You've got a really good voice. Have you ever thought about being in radio?" And I said, "No, never." And he said, "Well, I'm the manager of the CBC Northern Service Station here in Churchill, and we've got a nighttime position that I can't get anybody to fill. Would you be interested?" And I said, "Sure, absolutely. And my nights are free. I work days at Transair, and I ended up working nights starting the next night at the CBC, which tells you a lot about the CBC in those days. There was no HR department, certainly not in Churchill. Nobody came to interview me. Nobody wanted to see anything about my background. They just said, he can talk, he can move his lips, get him in front of a microphone. and that's how it all started.
So you get this job, and you're working as a disc jockey, but you have really no interest in being a disc jockey. Your interest lies in news and current affairs and public affairs.
I would love to have been a disc jockey, but I have no sense of music at all, ever. Even your experience as a tuba player didn't help. No. In fact, that was the final tip-off that this was never going to happen for me in music. Yeah. Anyway, I had grown up in a family that was always interested and curious about what was going on around them, and we'd talk about it at dinner. And that's kind of the basis of what journalism is about. You got to be curious, ask questions, tell other people what you've learned. And so that's what I did. They didn't have a newscast in Churchill. I suggested we start one. They said, "Sure, give it a try." And the rest is, history, as they say.
How long
Although journalism students, some of them still have this image that I went straight from the baggage counter at Transair into the desk reading the National. Yeah. That's not quite the way it worked.
How long were you in Churchill before you moved? Because you went from Churchill to Winnipeg. You got turned down in Belleville, Ontario.
I did. I sent my tapes in looking for a job in southern Canada while I was in Churchill, and they sent me a note back that basically said, "We don't see a future for you in broadcasting," and that was that. Eventually, I was 3 years in Churchill, then went to Winnipeg, then to Regina, then to Ottawa, then a little bit overseas, and then to Toronto, and started anchoring. So I was 20 years a reporter and 30 an anchor.
The story that you tell about covering Prince Charles' arrival in Churchill, as you're sitting with you're well prepared, you've got tons of notes. Prince Charles' helicopter flies overhead and blows all your notes into the air.
Exactly.
What did that teach you?
Well, it taught me that if you've prepared well enough, you don't need a whole bunch of notes. Mm-hmm. And, just simply the writing down of notes, is part of the memory machine for you. And that's what happened that day. I mean, I was horrified when I watched all these things fluttering down to the ground. I was up in a kind of a little mini tower, and he flew right above me. And the downdraft blew away all the notes. But I used that for the rest of my career, that experience. I mean, you got to prepare. You got to really be prepared. But at a certain point, you know it. Yeah. You don't need to refer to notes. And I didn't then, and I rarely do, even today in the work I do now.
Then there was a great situation where you were covering the arrival of Princess Margaret. And
I didn't do quite enough prep on that one.
But you were told specifically that she would be the first person to exit the aircraft. Am I correct?
You are correct. And
who was it?
It wasn't Princess Margaret, even though I said, "And there she is, Princess Margaret." what are those lapel, those wings on the lapels of her jacket? It was the flight attendant.
Yeah.
And while I was some distance from the plane, the viewers were up close because they were on the camera was zoomed in on her. And so I looked like a bit of a dope on that one. Fortunately, nobody in Toronto found out about that and didn't hinder my progress.
Was it when you were covering the arrival of Prince Charles? Was it then you were speaking with Lloyd Robertson? Did he throw it in?
Lloyd was the anchor of the network radio news at that point at CBC Radio. So this was 1970, and that's what Lloyd did in those days. And he threw to me on my first network experience at the CBC Live show, and we've had a few laughs about that ever since. I mean, Lloyd and I, obviously, he became the anchor of the National, the CBC. Then he left to go to CTV for a number of reasons, not the least of which was they paid him a heck of a lot of money, which benefited all of us because everybody's salary went up as a result of that move.
Right.
And so we saw each other, a lot while we were both the anchors of the two major competing networks. And the irony is that Lloyd was born and raised in Stratford, Ontario, and that's where I live now.
Right. So there's three famous people from Stratford: you, Lloyd, and Justin Bieber.
That other guy. That other guy that I used to, my wife is an actor, and she was on stage at Stratford for 20 years. And I used to go to see our son and I would go to see her matinee performances sometimes on, Saturday afternoon. So we'd go to the theater, and sitting there on the steps was this little kid with his guitar case in front of him taking coins. It was Justin. It was Justin Bieber when he was like 10 years old or 12 years old. And who would have thought it, right?
Yeah.
I keep trying to ask him, I did contribute. So where's the payback, buddy?
Did you ever meet him?
Meet him?
Like, have you ever interviewed him?
No, never interviewed him. I've tried, but he's, he's too up there in the stratosphere. I can get U.S. presidents, but
yeah, I know.
Justin Bieber, that's a challenge.
Very strange. I want to talk about a couple of things from your book. 1976, you're visiting China, specifically a medicinal clinic dealing with herbs, and you asked if they had anything that could assist in dealing with baldness, because I guess you were somewhat follically challenged at that point.
That's an accurate way of putting it. I was still, at that point, I don't think I was 30 yet. No, I was 28. And I just realized that I was starting to lose my hair. So they seem to have a cure for everything. So I said, what about baldness? And it all goes through like translators, and everybody was laughing. I thought, yeah, thank you. Just tell me about the pills you've got. And short story, they said, yeah, we have pills. This is the name of it. You can go to a clinic, what we call a drugstore, a pharmacy. And I went. I was in one of the big bank buildings. This was in Shanghai, along the Bund, the waterfront in Shanghai, and went in there, and a crowd gathered. This was still at the time when we were seeing, people from North America was a big deal in China. This is 76.
Right.
And so a crowd gathered to watch all this, and, when I explained again to the person, the pharmacist, that it was like for baldness, everybody laughed again, and they gave me these pills. I said, how many of these bottles have you got? And they said, I think they said 24, something like that, a lot. And I said, I'll take them all. So I took them all, brought them back to Canada, declared them at customs. I was living in Regina then, took them in. My roommate says, you might want to have those checked because the dosage was high. It was like 7 pills a day for, I can't remember now, 15 days, I think, something like that, or seven pills a day for a week. And then you took a week off, and then you did it again. And I said, my roommate said, you better have these checked. And so the doctor that I had used before I went to China, just to make sure I had the right shots and everything, was Chinese who'd come from China in 1949. So I took them to him, and he said, okay, I'll have these analyzed to let you know. And so, a week later he calls me up. He says, oh, these will do nothing for your hair. I said, what are you talking about? Is there a better business bureau somewhere I can call?
Yeah.
And I said, what are they? He says, they are aphrodisiac.
Mm-hmm.
I said, what? that's not what I asked for. And he said, can I have this one bottle? That was my cure for baldness. As you can tell, it didn't work.
Did it work as an aphrodisiac, though?
Well, that I'll never know because, of course, I never needed to take that.
Of course not. 1978, you're in. You're not
gonna make me tell every single story.
No, I wouldn't.
There's got to be the whole idea of this is we're trying to encourage people to go buy the book.
That's why I'm just touching on some stories. In 1978, a Soviet satellite crashes in the Northwest Territories. This is an important story for you.
It is.
And you did a live report for CBS News for Walter Cronkite, who was your and probably every single newscaster in the free world. They were heroes. They were a hero to everyone in the news industry. So you're doing a report for Walter Cronkite, and you did a great job. Someone says you're going to get an offer from CBS, and lo and behold, you did.
That's right. Next day, they called to ask me if I wanted to come down and talk to them. And that was the beginning of a kind of really nice relationship with both CBS and, as it turned out, NBC as well. Mm-hmm. Trying to encourage me to join the Air Force. At that point, it was as a correspondent. CBS was interested in Johannesburg for me to go there to South Africa. NBC at one point was talking Paris. But this was 78, and I had told the CBC and was excited about being in their election coverage, and we thought 78 was going to be the election year. As it turned out, it was 79. But I did the election campaign, covered Joe Clark and his actual winning campaign against Pierre Trudeau. So I said no, but I maintained a great relationship with American networks. I have a lot of friends there, and the one thing that at least I found out about Americans and American companies is when you say no to them, they think you're even better than you are. And so they end up coming back, and they did a few times.
And specifically in 1987, where Howard Stringer, who's the man, by the way, for those of you who don't know, he was the head of CBS News, and then later on the head of CBS Programming. He's the guy who brought David Letterman over to CBS. But he offered you to co-host the CBS Morning Show, which was floundering at the time against ABC and NBC, offering you lots of money in the millions for 3 years, to which you, mostly because of your friends and Norton Nash, who was the anchor of the National at the time, just said you wouldn't want to do this job, and Norton said, "I'm going to step down. I don't want you to go." That was quite amazing. You must have been shocked when you heard that.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And Norton had other ideas that wanted to pursue, including writing books. He was a very successful author, wrote half a dozen or more books, and he wanted to spend his time on that. He'd done 10 years doing the National, and so he wanted me to take over. And I was that kid who'd started in Churchill, who'd been given a heck of a break by the CBC, and I just felt, here's the best job in Canadian television journalism sitting in front of me. Am I really going to walk away from it? The money wasn't anything like the CBS money, but it was still very good money. Mm-hmm. And so I said, I'm staying.
Didn't he make some kind of a remark where your friend said something like, do you really want to interview chefs and actors and circus performers? To which you said, well, I like to cook. My wife's an actor, but I don't know how to juggle. Something like that?
Yeah, it was something like that. Maybe not quite with the finesse of the Ted Willishin kind in the way I said it, but that is true. That is what a good friend of mine, Mark Starwich, right, who was the executive producer of the Journal at the time.
Sure.
That's what he said as his closing argument to try and convince me not to go.
More of Ted Woloshin with iconic news anchor Peter Mansbridge right after this.
Hey, it's Ted Woloshin for Tom's Place. Our fall merchandise is starting to arrive, and we've got massive amounts of summer clothing that needs to be cleared. Blowout prices on virtually everything, like designer suits, regularly up to $5.99, now from $167 to $267. beautiful sports jackets, starting at only $167, and designer dress pants and shirts, all at $67. Check out our deals throughout the store on the very best of designer menswear. Huge savings off our already below retail prices. If you need a suit for an upcoming wedding or any special occasion, we are Toronto's one-stop suit shop. For the finest outfit for every occasion, there is no better time to find the perfect addition to your wardrobe. Everything is on sale to make way for our fall merchandise. Tom's Place is open 11 to 6 weekdays, 10 to 5 Saturday, 12 to 5 Sunday. Visit Tom's Place, 190 Baldwin in Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. Have you been tasked with the role of a state executor, or expected maybe in the future you will be? Well, if so, let me make your life a lot simpler by introducing you to my friend Debbie Stanley. Debbie is the founder of ETP Canada. They specialize in estate administration. Their goal simply is to help Canadian executors understand their role and how to deal with the loved one's estate. Let's face it, there's no school for this, but ETP Canada offers services such as executor support, estate accounting, and they have a new online course called Executor Ready. It's an engaging video designed to make estate administration easier and affordable. And those are two comforting thoughts during a stressful time. So call Debbie Stanley at 1-866-309-0387. That's 1-866-309-0387. Or you can get her at info@etpcanada.ca. That's info@etpcanada.ca.
Now back to Ted Wallachin.
Peter Mansbridge is my guest today. His book is called Off the Record. It is not a memoir. And you specifically pointed out that you don't want people to think of it as a memoir because you don't want people to think that you're dying or you're dead. Something
Exactly.
like that?
And I'm still a busy guy. I stepped down from the National in 2017. But since then, I do 2 one-hour documentaries a year for the CBC. I just came back from the Arctic, where I was up for a couple of weeks earlier this summer, about a month ago, for a documentary I'm doing on Arctic sovereignty and climate change, which will be on early in the new year. I do a daily podcast. For Sirius XM, I write speeches, I write books, and I sit on a few boards. So I'm busy, but it's at my pace. Like, I determine how much I'm going to do and when I'm going to do it.
And you have your own charity work.
I have my own foundation, and that foundation supports a number of important projects, both local and national. I'm proud of that fact, and I support a number of journalism schools with scholarships for journalism students. Let's
talk about journalism today and your thoughts on what you hear. I mean, so much of it has been affected in the last, say, 10 years by social media. And what I find extremely disturbing is, especially now with the battle against COVID and the vaxxers versus the anti-vaxxers, and the information that is being spewed out there in public and on social media is extremely disturbing for 2 reasons. A, it's BS, and B, it undercuts the credibility of the legitimate media. How do you battle that?
Well, you battle it with facts. It is a huge challenge right now. I mean, listen, we live at a time when there's more information available at our fingertips than ever before in the history of the planet, and yet a lot of that information is total garbage.
Yep.
It's all over the internet, and that's not to take away from the fact the internet is an unbelievable tool of good, but at the same time, it has this incredible amount of bad, and nobody seems willing or able or coming up with the right program to deal with that, and whether it's Facebook or you name it. There are issues in terms of how to deal with bad information. At the same time, partly because of that, the media itself, even important traditional sections of the media, are being challenged by those who depend upon it to convince their supporters that what they're telling them is true, that it's honest. and that it's not fiction or misinformation. And to be able to do that, you've got to be much more transparent in the way you explain how you do what you do, how you decide what's news, how you decide what's going to be the top of the newscast, what's not going to make it there, why you give certain people anonymity as sources, why you give anybody anonymity as a source. That there's a need out there for the media in general to be more transparent. And that's just one of the issues surrounding how you tackle this, but it is one of them.
So one thing I once said to somebody, I said, the problem with the news from social media and blogs, etc., is that those people who write blogs don't have editors. You in television and people who write for legitimate newspapers, they have an editor, and they won't let anything by unless it's cleared. A blogger doesn't have an editor. A blogger has an agenda. It's a big difference.
There is a big difference, and I don't want to overgeneralize here. Just like the media is not a monolith, and it operates in different fashions depending on the organization.
Sure.
Some bloggers take their work a lot more seriously than others.
Yes.
And what they put out there. But I hear what you're saying, and I don't disagree with it.
And then again, you look at CNN, they once broadcast that you were the president of Poland.
Yeah. But I was.
Is it true that people ask you to sign your book and sign autographs as the president of Poland?
Yes, some people have asked me to do that.
The story for those who haven't read the book, and they should, John Paul II's funeral, and the media had an opportunity to line up to pay their tributes to the pontiff. And CNN captured it on video and said, "There he is, ladies and gentlemen, the president of Poland," and the camera was focused on you.
It was. Yeah, I dined out on that for a while.
Yeah, I guess I would have too. Yeah. Let me get your thoughts on some prime ministers, not all, but the first prime minister that you ever met was John Diefenbaker. And you were what, 9?
10. Yeah, 10, 9 or 10. Yeah, my sister and I had been picked to appear in a film for the National Film Board called Michael and Mary Visit the Parliament Buildings. Mm-hmm. They gave us like stage names, and we spent a week, filming on Parliament Hill, and it ended up in the big moment was to meet the Prime Minister. This was 1958, and John Diefenbaker had just been reelected with the biggest majority government in the history of the country at that point. And we spent not a long time, maybe 15 minutes in his office while they took the different shots they needed, and he was very nice, extremely kind. And when I went to him 20 years later with one of the pictures from that shoot to get him to sign it, he looked at it and he says, "I remember that day." And Deef always used to say, people used to say, the guy's got an unbelievable memory. And it became kind of part of the Deef myth. Mm-hmm. And, weren't sure whether to believe it. Well, that day I believed it because he said, "Yeah, your mother was there, and she told me how you just come over from England and blah, blah, blah," which was all true. Wow. So he was, he may have had a few other faults, but memory wasn't one of them.
Wow, that's an incredible story. Let's move forward now to Pierre Trudeau, who you compared
him. He didn't have a memory. He wouldn't have remembered me the day after. He had other things to worry about.
Yeah, I'm sure he did. But you described the difference between him and his son Justin as Pierre was the intellect, Justin is the guy with the street smarts. And I always thought to myself, the expression, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And I'm thinking, in this case, boy, not only did it fall far from the tree, it bounced on the road and landed in Tofino.
Yeah, you could say that. But, listen, it's true, though. Trudeau had, Pierre Trudeau the elder, as I call him, was very much, the intellect and didn't suffer fools well. Justin Trudeau the younger, he kind of, in spite of the fact he provokes the same kind of passions as his father did. I mean, people, there are some people out there who really dislike the Trudeaus, both of them. But, he actually loves being around people. He has no problem, going into a crowd, talking to people.
Right.
And, and that's why I say he has street smarts, although he didn't use them that day when he went to Tofino. That's for sure. That was just we all make mistakes.
Sure,
No
absolutely.
different. But that was a blunder. That was more than just a mistake.
John Turner, the man who fascinates me for a number of different reasons. One of which is that he managed to stay friends with a lot of people in the media, you included, and your colleague Lloyd Robertson as well, had good relationships with John Turner.
Sure.
It's not often that common amongst politicians and members of the media.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I ever had any enemies as prime minister. Jean Chrétien and I had a tough time for a few years, but for the most part, I wouldn't say they're friends, but I have no problem talking with them or getting interviews with them when I wanted to. But deep friendships is not something I would suggest happen with any of them. But with John Turner, we were friends before he came back into politics in 1984. And we were friends after he left politics, and we'd have lunch together and talk about, everything from old times to new times and his take on stuff. And I always thoroughly enjoyed being with him, talking with him. I think it's unfortunate in a way that he didn't get to be prime minister longer than he was, only a couple of months. He'd blame himself, and he was probably right in that. I mean, he was out of touch with how things had changed from when he'd been in politics earlier. But a decent man who believed absolutely in democracy, and that if we believed in it, we had to participate in some fashion. And he would always talk about that.
Brian Mulroney.
I've done some very tough reporting on Brian Mulroney for, I don't need to go through the list of things for you. But at the same time, we've remained friends in the sense that he can pick up the phone, call me. I can pick up the phone and get through to him. I get his advice on certain international events. He's always been fabulous at that. And I think the country owes him more than they've given for a number of reasons. A lot of people have never forgiven him for free trade or the GST or Airbus or, the list goes on. But there were other things that he accomplished in his time as somebody who made big change in the country, didn't just sort of kind of sit back and let things happen. And he also was a real force on the international stage, much more than I think his country gives him credit for. Others give him credit for it. South Africa, if it wasn't for Brian Mulroney, who knows whether Nelson Mandela ever would have got out of jail.
Yeah.
I mean, he forced that issue, which led to the end of apartheid and led to everyone having a vote, and led to Mandela becoming president. I mean, Brian Mulroney was an instrumental factor in that, and he went up against the likes of Reagan and Bush and Thatcher to make that happen.
Very quickly here, before I let you go, I just want to talk about two historic, significant events. The fall of the Berlin Wall, which you were there, and you met someone who quite fascinated you, a 35-year-old research scientist during that period of time who went on to become the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel. How did you meet her?
I didn't actually meet her, but she was on when I was broadcasting from one side of the wall that weekend. It turns out she was on the other side, and she was still at that point a student, but believed in what was happening, believed at the possibility of freedom, and under that old Turner theory of if you believe in democracy, you have to participate. She participated. She started running in elections, and she started winning, and she eventually became not only the Chancellor of Germany, but for many people, she became the leader of the free world during the Trump years.
Right.
Because none of the other leaders had any respect for Trump. had a lot of respect for Angela Merkel.
Right.
And as she eases out of the stage spotlight, she's going to be missed.
Was that the biggest story that you ever covered? The fall of the Berlin Wall? Because, of course, it led to the fall
actually being there. I mean, the biggest story was probably 9/11 for everything that it meant at the time and has meant since. But I did all of that from a studio in Toronto. Berlin, I was in Berlin. And there's nothing like actually being there when something happens. And every journalist will tell you that if the opportunity exists to be at a moment in time that literally changes the world, you want to be there. And that was one of them.
And you have a brick.
I have a piece of the wall. I have a piece of the Great Wall of China. I have a piece of the beaches at Normandy, the tunnels under Vimy Ridge. That's been my kind of collection point, and that's what I look for when I have the opportunity to pick something up.
And then after Berlin, it was on to Moscow, and a knock on the hotel door. You open the door, and it's a Soviet soldier. What did you think at first?
Oh, I was scared to hell. I thought, I don't know what I did wrong, but there's a soldier standing here, and he doesn't look particularly happy. And the next moment, he took his hat off and said, $100 US or $20 US. As he went through all the different things he had, from hat to belt to medals. And it was this is November 89, and the Soviet Union was still the Soviet Union. But it was the indication, coupled with what had just happened in Berlin, that the clock was ticking on this, what in fact was a failed state. And sure enough, it was gone within the next couple of years. But that soldier, in a way, said it all to me better than any political scientist could tell me. When your army starts selling off its uniforms, it's probably time to think about the future.
Yeah, exactly. But I want your opinion or your thoughts on one more topic, one more individual, that being the late Gord Downie.
Well, Gord was a friend to a lot of people. He was a friend to me. I'd known him for 25 years, and suddenly here I was, doing an interview with him. He knew he was dying. I knew he was dying. Everybody knew he was dying. He hadn't given an interview at that point. He'd done his tour of the country with the Tragically Hip. And, we sat there in a rehearsal studio, and he'd written all these names on his palm of his hand, including mine, because he was afraid that his memory was going to fail him in the middle of the interview about things he wanted to say and about people he wanted to talk about. And that was, as I said, on the one hand, you knew what was happening here. We were losing him. But seeing that was just like really, had a huge impact. But listen, Gord Downie will be remembered forever for his music. And he should be remembered forever for trying to encourage us to do the right thing on the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, and to find reconciliation in terms of the residential school question. He fought for all that at the end. That's what his whole last couple of years were about. And the fact that he had an impact, especially on young people, through doing that, may, in fact, make the difference on that question.
What an amazing story.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just wrap this up by going right back to the beginning. You dedicated the book to your grandchildren so that they can remember what Grampy did before they came along. And they would probably remember that Grampy was in the Disney film Zootopia as Peter Mansbridge.
That's probably all they'll remember. Yeah, Zootopia was fun. I was in it for like 8 seconds or something, but it was the crucial 8 seconds, Ted.
A Golden Globe winning award-winning film.
Oscar winning too.
Exactly.
I mean, without those 8 seconds, I'm not sure it could have made it.
I'd wait for the sequel, as you pointed out in the book.
Yeah.
Peter Mansbridge, it's been a real pleasure. I thank you very much. And the book's called Off the Record. It's great. I look forward to listening to your podcast, The Bridge, as well, on Sirius XM.
Thanks, Ted. Always a treat.
All the best to you, sir. And thank you to all of you for tuning in and listening, and we hope that you'll join us again next week. And if you get a chance, drop by our website, www.tedwoloshin.ca, and there you will find a listing of all of our previous episodes. You can listen back to all of them. You can sign up and share your comments and thoughts with us. We would appreciate that. Also appreciate going online and check out the organ and tissue donation opportunities. You could change or even save a life. Have a great week.
The Ted Woloshyn Podcast has been brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. And ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. The Ted Woloshyn Podcast is produced by me, Becky Coles. Technical production by Paul Gatt. Music by Bike Thieves. For more information on this podcast and our sponsors, and to talk to Ted, go to www.tedwoloshyn.ca.